Hello, everyone out there. You are welcome to Living a Full Life Forum. I'm Dr. Violet Kayom. So today we are discussing a topic that actually affects the whole human race, especially in our times, and that is fear. Fear is something that has been proved to kill many more dreams than actually failure does. And fear on a normal day should actually be protective. It is the normal response by the body to protect us from danger. Now, the problem comes when fear ends up becoming chronic, when it takes a chronic course, and that's crippling our ability to do our day-to-day functions, or if the fear is disproportionate to the threat. Okay, so as regards the definition of fear, fear is an unpleasant emotional response, an unpleasant emotional sensation which occurs in response to a real or perceived threat. Okay, so this can be a threat to a threat of danger, a threat of pain, or harm. So the body comes into action to protect us from this danger that may be real or perceived. So when we look at the science behind fear, it will help us know and understand why we actually must be able to differentiate between the good fear that is protective and then the bad fear that can actually incapacitate us. Like I said before, studies have proved that fear has killed many more people and many more dreams than actually failure has done. And a great orator, the late Dr. Miles Monroe, always say that one of the richest places in the whole world is a cemetery. And it's because in the cemetery, that is where all the dreams and the good plans and the good projects are buried with the people, because people were too afraid to step out to do what they were called to do. Okay, so let's start with the science behind fear. There is an organ in our brain that is responsible for processing and managing our fear emotions. Okay, and it's called the amygdala. The amygdala is a tiny almond-shaped organ which is found in a certain part of the brain. Now, what it does is when it receives input, it receives all these messages through our sight, through our hearing, and through our senses. When it receives a message that is a fear factor, for instance, when you look at something that is scary or you hear, a loud bang, it will immediately jerk and go into activity. So the amygdala ends up, sending impulses to the rest of the brain, to the rest of the body, and then the glands become active, especially the adrenal glands, which produce a very important hormone called cortisol and also adrenaline. Now, these hormones end up causing our heartbeat to increase, our blood pressure rises, and then there is a surge of energy, a surge of blood flow to our muscles and the limbs and the brain. So basically, all the areas of our body that is critical for survival at that point is charged up because of the effect of the amygdala and then the hormones. So all these are really to prepare us for reaction to this danger. So our eyes become dilated, then you get sweaty hands, and you hyperventilate, and all this increase your body's ability to face the danger. Now that is what we call the fight or flight reaction. So when the body perceives that this danger is actually manageable at that point, then you'll be able to fight it. But if it perceives that it's way beyond you, then you'll be able to run, and then you'll go out of the danger. Okay, so let's take an example that you walk into your office, you open the door to your office or the door to your classroom, the door to your bedroom, and you find a huge snake in the middle of the room with its head raised up and it's facing you. So the amygdala will immediately respond by sending all these impulses, and before long you realize that you will start breathing very fast and your heartbeat will go high, your blood pressure will go high, and immediately you will get the next object that you can use to hit this snake, or you will run for your life. Now at this point, the organ has done us great, so keeping us away from danger. Now around that time when all that is going on, the brain is noting many things around the circumstance and keeping a memory of them. So it will note the circumstances around this danger. It will note the objects around, the smell, basically the whole environment, and this forms into our memory. Now this is good in the short run, but in the long run, you end up finding that you may actually respond to those associations to that danger, even when the real danger is not there. Okay, so that is something that we need to remember as regards fear. So when the part of the brain that is responsible for processing this fear emotion is active, it results into an impairment of some parts of the brain that are actually responsible for critical thinking, decision making, for reasoning and judgment. So meaning at the point when you are emotionally charged up as regards this fear, then that part of the brain that would help you to think logically and make the right decisions may actually be impaired. So that is why fear, when it is, really as a result of a perceived or a real danger in the short run may be okay. But if it is prolonged, then it becomes a very huge problem, because you cannot work well and reason well when the part of your brain that is responsible for reasoning and judgment is being impaired by the high inputs of the fear, impulses, coming in. Okay, so now that takes us to our next part of the discussion. What are the effects of chronic fear? The effects of chronic fear. So chronic fear will result into our physical aspect of our body being affected, then our mental aspect, our social life, and then even the generations after us. Okay, just like I said before, when the stress hormones are being released, the blood vessels end up becoming, constricted. Then the heart rate goes up, the blood pressure rises. So if you are having continuous input of those hormones, if they are continuously being, released into your body as a result of a persistent fear factor, let's say you are in a relationship which is very hostile, or you're living in a home where there's a lot of domestic violence, or you're faced with a chronic disease that is bringing a lot of fear unto you, or you work with a boss or colleagues who are very, frightening. So when there's that chronic fear, there's increased, discharge of these hormones for a long time, and that is detrimental to our blood vessels and to our heart. So meaning you can end up actually getting diseases like high blood pressure and other heart diseases. It can affect our digestive system, causing peptic ulcer disease and other indigestion problems. Our muscles end up being very tensed up. The muscles, when they are very tensed up for a long time, may cause a lot of pain and a lot of fatigue. It may actually affect also fertility. It may result into sexual dysfunction. Okay, then even our skin can be affected when there's prolonged exposure to these hormones, to these stress hormones. It can result into, all kinds of skin rashes, and pimples. Yes, so all these, then of course it can lead to accelerated aging. When we are faced with chronic fear, you find that the aging process is increased. So you end up aging much faster, and that means that even premature death can set in. So that is why it's important that we know how to manage chronic fear or a chronic fear factor so that it doesn't affect our physical health. Now, in the mental aspect, like I said, the brain also has issues, it faces when there's prolonged exposure to a fear factor. So the aspect that is responsible for your critical thinking and your judgment ends up being impaired. So meaning most of the decisions you make at that point may not be rational decisions, they may not be logical decisions. And then it will affect the long-term memory. So people who are exposed to fear for a long time end up not remembering many things, that they should be able to remember. And then of course it can lead to also mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so the social effect of chronic fear is mainly that it will affect our interpersonal relationships. When you are in a fearful state, you will not make meaningful relationships with people around you, because you either be very paranoid of them or too scared, to step out. And now that becomes a very huge problem, because then the right people cannot surround you. And instead, it can actually attract the people who want to take you for granted, who want to use you for that moment. The insecure people are the ones who will be attracted to you. The other thing that fear does in our social aspect is that it actually reduces our creativity. Fear can incapacitate you to the point that you become, in a state of inertia. You simply can't move. You cannot come up with any good business ideas. It can affect how you respond, especially if you're in a managerial position, how you respond to any challenge that comes your way. So it ends up dampening our social relationships. Okay, then of course fear also can actually be inherited. It has been shown that families or groups of people that have suffered genocide or slavery and all that end up having generations after them that seem to suffer from the same fears their predecessors suffered from. Yes, so as you work on your fear, you know that you are also helping your children and the generations after you. And that is why we have to take very critical interest in this here. And like I said before, fear is a normal physiological reaction. But the problem comes when it is very prolonged, it stays on prolonged, or our body is responding excessively to a fear factor that is even not that big, and yet we are out there releasing all these hormones in huge amounts. Now then it becomes a very huge problem. And apart from the physiological fear, all these other fears we experience are actually learned behaviors. So we learn them as we are growing up. Our parents may tell us that no, don't go, into the water, you may easily drown, or don't hold the knife, you may get hurt. So as part of their discipline and bringing us up, they may say words that actually get imprinted into us and cause fear. Then as we are interacting with our peers during our childhood, you find that there's a lot of, you can easily become vulnerable to fear when you are young, especially fear of rejection. So if you do something that is weird and you feel ashamed and your peers laugh at you, or they reject you from being in their group because of one reason or the other, so that pain that you feel ends up getting imprinted in us. So later on as we grow up, we should be fearing less, but instead the memory of that pain that we went through when we're being rejected or when we're being subjected to shame and all that, it ends up playing in us. And so the body ends up trying to protect us from going through a similar experience. Okay. Now, even when there is not really a serious threat, so the body ends up reacting that way. So what are some of these different forms of fears, the common ones that we experience in our day-to-day living? Of course, now we are going to look at mainly the fears that come in with regards to our relationships with people and, our day-to-day living. And we may not spend too much time on the phobias. Phobias are a certain form of fear that is, the fear is way beyond, the actual threat, that someone may actually fear just, height, standing on, a high place, or they may fear water and all that. So those ones may need special therapies. But the day-to-day fears that we face as we work, as we study, as we live with our family members and friends is what we are going to tackle at the moment. So the first common form of fear, which is a huge one, is fear of rejection. And like I said before, most times it is something that is learned. You learn it early, and as you grow up, there's that memory of the bad experience that you felt at that point when you're being rejected. And so you don't want a repeat of that. But what is very unfortunate is that actually in life, there are very few people who will reject us. When you look at the percentage of people who might reject you and those who actually accept you or are neutral with you, the ones who accept you, are neutral with you, are much more than those who would reject you. And just know that for someone to reject you, most times it's because they themselves are either insecure or they may be concerned about you, but they just do not know, how to bring up the matter. So you find that there are some people who are very insecure and all they do is to throw out comments out there. They throw out comments which may hurt you, and then you end up feeling rejected. But we shouldn't be able to absorb every comment that comes our way. Okay, so sometimes we end up not stepping out to do things because we fear what people may say. We fear, how it may end up, whether people will accept us or not. So some people end up remaining in abusive relationships because they fear that, when they move out, they may be rejected. People may say this and that. So we may end up staying in a job that is not even good enough for us just because of so many fears of rejection. Sometimes we fear missing out, and yet these things are not really helping us. So they end up dampening our creativity. The fear dampens our creativity, so we can't step out. Let me give an example of when I stepped out to do this online program of Living a Full Life Forum. I had my own emotional struggles over a long period of time, and to some degrees I had already overcome, a number of them. And as I interacted with people, I realized that many people actually needed the advice I was giving them from my personal, testimony. But the thought of going online just put me off. Why? Because I had the fear that will they really accept the information I'm giving them? Will I have favor before people? What if it doesn't work out? So I had my personal fears. What if I'm rejected? Now at that point I had a choice to make, whether to allow the fear voice I'm hearing behind me to take over, or to just allow the passion I'm feeling, to overpower the fear. And so I decided to step out there, and follow the passion and follow my heart. And that is why we've ended up with Living a Full Life Forum. So I just want to say this out there for someone who may be struggling with an idea, with an initiative, and all that is keeping you back is fear, and that is fear of rejection. And you will never know your full potential unless you step out, unless you calm down that fear and you do not allow it to stop you. Okay, so fear of rejection is something huge that we really have to pay attention to. The second is fear of loss. When you have experienced loss, either losing someone or losing finances, the pain is huge. Okay, the pain is huge, and you just don't want to go through that experience again. Now, the problem is many times we live life in anticipation of the next problem. We live life in anticipation of the next thing that will go wrong. So we don't live life in a positive way. And we think by doing this, we are guarding our hearts from, from pain or disappointment. But, it instead actually hinders our creativity. You see, when we spend all our time fearing the loss of, let's say, finances, or fearing, death, let's say you have a chronic sickness, or you have a child who is struggling with drugs, or, you're fearing the failure of an exam. When you focus on that fear for a long time, it drains your emotional energy, the energy that you'd use to prepare yourself, to adjust yourself to the situation in case the loss occurred. In fact, most times the loss will not actually occur. A study has shown that 95% of the things we fear most don't even actually happen. They don't happen. So we spend so much time with our emotions in this fear state, and yet actually what we are fearing may never even happen. But even if that was to happen, if we spent that energy we are spending in fear, if we spent it in something more creative, adjusting ourselves and making sure that, we prepare, for the time of loss, then we will have a more meaningful, experience during the time of the loss. I remember a time, when I was going through difficulties in my finances, in my business. It was difficult, okay? And I feared a lot. I was like, will this business collapse? What will I do? How will we pay the workers and all that? But I realized that the more I spent my energy and my focus on that fear, the more I feared and the more I couldn't do anything about it and how to improve the setup. But the moment I changed my focus and decided to organize, the organization afresh and reduce the expenses and all that, then I realized that we're actually able to move through that period despite, the inadequate finances that we are having. So the fear of loss can cripple us and prevent us from being creative, and yet it doesn't even provide us any solution. The other thing that we fear may be the fear of man or authority, okay? So the fear of authority is something that is very huge also. Especially in a family setup where maybe either the parents or a spouse may be very frightening, very intimidating, or in a work setup, where the supervisor, the boss is really an intimidating one. Sometimes it may occur in school, okay, where either the teachers or some of your peer groups are very frightening, okay. So that fear of someone who is in authority, or the fear of man, can actually also affect us a lot. I remember a lady sharing her experience of living in her home, where whenever she would hear the hooting of a car, she would go into panic. And the reason was that the husband would come home and was extremely aggressive, verbally, physically. And so she always lived in this state of panic and fear. She always feared the time when, the husband would come home. And so any car that would pass by and hoot, then it would set her into panic. Now, that is a very dangerous state to live in. Okay, you cannot live in such a state for a long time. It will affect you, for a long time. And so you'll have to confront that fear. Okay, one thing we have to know that a man is man is flesh and blood. And so we should have no reason to fear man so much in a crippling way. Okay, there's the good fear that is more of respect, but it shouldn't be something that should frighten us so much to cause us to be incapacitated, just because it's an authority figure. And we are going to look shortly at how we can really face and confront some of those fears. Okay, then of course there is fear of failure. Fear of failure is actually what makes us not pursue our dreams, and many times we end up not really living to our full life's potential. I have listened to a number of successful businessmen and influential leaders, and one common thing they say that they tried a number of things and they failed repeatedly, but they did not allow the failure to push them down. Now, the problem with some of us that when you've tried one or two things and failed, then you give up. And it is true that the pain of failure is actually immense. I have had situations where you write a project, you apply for this grant, and you're turned off. And when that happens 3 times, the energy starts going low. But the people who have persisted have actually also gained a lot. Because from that failure, there's some nuggets of gold that you can pick that can make you actually stand firm. I always say that, the lessons that you learn in your valleys, in your low moments, are the lessons that are going to keep you stable and sane and sober in your hilltop moments. Whatever resilience that you build when you're down here in the pain of failure, in the pain of discouragement, that resilience that you build, that soberness that you build, that stability that you build, is what will actually keep you sane up there. Because sometimes it's actually more difficult to deal with a fame, when you're, in your success, in your hilltops, of success. It is more difficult to deal with the fame and all that than it is when you are down here in your valley. Yes, so that stamina that you build down in your low moments, in your failure, and the lesson that you learn will make you know how to treat other people well and how to push down your pride when you are basking in your success, in your glory. Okay, so the fear of failure should not keep us from moving. It is important that we learn the nuggets of gold from those failure moments, and then we move on to the next with more wisdom. Okay, so another thing like failure, the fear of change and fear of the unknown. These are huge things, and of course, just like we see, anything that presents itself in uncertainties, anything where there seem to be struggles, all these things will really put us in fear because they push us out of our comfort zone. But we have to know that life, is full of changes. Changes are, a fact of life. And the better, we embrace it, the better we will do at, living through the change moments instead of standing off in fear. Yes, so Those are some of the common fears that we face on a day-to-day basis, and we have to learn how to confront it. And why should we really do this? Fear, the more you focus on fear, the more it grows. Fear is like this other, a self-made monster. The more you focus on it, the more it grows. So if you have a workmate who is so threatening and you focus on them and whatever they're doing a lot, it will actually grow. And the less you focus on that fear factor, then it shrinks and becomes smaller. Okay, then fear also ends up creating a lot of imaginations in our minds. We end up thinking way beyond even the fear factor. So we create stories in our minds when we are in a fearful state, stories of negative things only, of how things may end up the wrong way, and yet actually these may not be true things. So our imaginations end up being affected in the wrong way when we are focusing so much on fear. I remember a situation where I was in a fearful state because of some breakdown in communication in the family. And so I just did not know how to handle that situation. But anyway, I went to attend this function where they were giving a lot of, talks and help, that would benefit me and my family. Now, when I looked at that time, I saw it was getting a bit late. I needed this information very much that I was attending, in the function where I was attending. I needed the information very much because I knew it would help me and my family. But also, I was scared of reaching home late just because of that breakdown in communication. So at one point, I made up my mind that I would attend this function anyway, up to the end, because it would help me. So I sat there and continued listening. But suddenly, some fear thought came into me. And I became very fearful of the whole situation of what would happen at home. In addition to all that is going on now, me going back late. And at that point, the more I focused on the fear, the more I became very scared. And I just made a drastic decision and got up and I was like, let me just go back home. So as I drove, I found a lot of traffic. It was so heavy, I couldn't reach home early. A journey that was supposed to take me 1 hour ended up taking me 3 whole hours. Now, I reached home late anyway. So I left this where I was benefiting a lot just because of one thought of fear, just because I focused on the fear very much and formed my imagination of the scenarios. And then I still ended up reaching home late. And when I reached home late, I still didn't face whatever I feared. There was no extreme arguments and all that about my coming back late. So you find that you end up missing both. When we allow fear to drive us, when we allow fear, to dwell around us, we come up with wrong conclusions, then we make the wrong decisions driven by fear. Then fear pushes us to make the wrong actions. So we end up losing all through. So that is why whenever you're in a fearful circumstance, it's important that you watch out the decisions that you make. So how can we confront this fear? The practical steps. Number 1, the first thing you have to do is to acknowledge the fear that you have. You see, many times we pass over our lives and we think that, these things don't affect us. Maybe that is for the weaklings, that is for the other side. But if you sit down with yourself and look through your life, you would be able to actually identify areas where you fear, where fear seems to be reigning. For instance, fear of change, fear of rejection, fear of those in authority, fear of failure. Those fears, it's important to highlight them. And then make sure you've tried to find out the root cause, because some of these you can actually get the root cause. For instance, that lady whom I explained about, who was so scared of any hoot of a car, it was because of the violence she was experiencing in the home. And it's until she had to rise up and confront that fear that there was order. That is when the husband became a bit more orderly, okay, and started respecting her. Okay, so you have to identify Acknowledge that you have the fear, identify it, and try to identify the root causes. That is what will help you start working on it. Okay. Some people, have fears like when they're growing up, maybe growing up under a very authoritative parent, who has so many rules, or a parent who is very fearful, don't do this, don't do the other. So they're extremely careful, and now that imprints fear in you. When you get to that root cause, then it can help you face that fear better. Okay. The second is, it's important that when you have identified the fear, apply logic to it. Just like I said, when fear is in control, when fear is the one driving you, the part of our brain that is responsible for reasoning and judgment ends up being subdued. So most of the decisions we make are illogical. They are irrational decisions. They are more of impulsive decisions. So it's important that you put this fear and then apply logic to it. For instance, if you are fearing to start up a project, if you have fear of starting up, an initiative, you can now, try to apply logic. Okay, so if I started this and it worked, what would it do? But if it failed, would that mean that I am a failure? Okay, and then let's say the fear of a spouse or a supervisor who is very tough. You need to apply logic. This is a human being just like me. Okay, this is flesh and blood. So if I do the right thing, or if I did the wrong thing, would that mean that I am that terrible? Would it lead to the end of my life? If you fear, changing a job, or if you fear losing that job because of that supervisor, would the loss of that job mean the end of your life? And there are other people living without that job actually, and they're living very meaningful life. So it is important to confront, that fear with facts. Okay. So if it is an exam, you fear, sitting an exam, you need to find out how many exams have you sat in the past and actually passed. And if you feel that you're not prepared for this particular exam, you have to know that most examinations are set in such a way that it actually does more of, testing the long-term memory, things that you have learned that have already been embedded in you. What you have learned currently it's just a heap up on whatever is already there. Okay. So just because you haven't read this particular topic, will it mean that the whole exam will be only around those topics? So you have to really challenge every fear with the facts. And now at that point, you're priming your brain, okay? You are trying to activate that part of the brain that has been impaired, that part of the brain that reasons and gives good judgment and critical decisions, okay? You're trying to now activate it, okay? So that is a process, and that is an exercise that you must. So it comes, with all the different fears: fear of failure, fear of loss. Just because you lose out on this business, does it mean that you will never start up any business or you will never succeed? There are many others who have lost, millions in business. You lose millions of shillings. Does that mean the end of your life? So you need to always bring the facts. The third is focus away from the fear. Okay, do not put all your energy in how things may go wrong or in the fear factor. If it is somebody who makes you afraid, do not focus on that bad aspect of the person. Look at them as a normal human being. If it is something about maybe starting a new, a new business, okay, just focus on the good. That if things went well, how would your life be transformed? And it has been said that the bigger the fear before a project, the greater the joy that awaits you on the other side. If only you can pass through that process, if only you can allow fear not to cripple you, okay? And then the fourth is, it's important to move fast when you've decided to do something, because the more you delay, the more you procrastinate, the more the fear builds up. I remember my daughter sharing that, how she was trying to jump. They were doing some high jump. And whenever she would try to jump over that, whatever it was, she would feel afraid and the brothers would laugh. So over days, it's like she failed to do it. So one day she said she ran and she decided not to think about the negative. She decided to just jump. And indeed, she jumped over that high, whatever they had placed, that high barrier. So She said that she decided not to focus on the fear, but to just go. And when she did, indeed, she jumped. Yes, so sometimes hesitating for a long time may actually allow the fear to build up so much. Okay? And then it's important that the fifth, I think that must be the fifth or something. Do the exact opposite of what your fear is telling you. Okay? So fear is telling you, don't do it. Try to master the courage to do it. And that brings me to courage. You must have the courage to face, life. You must have the courage to face that failure, that authoritative figure. You must have the courage to face them. Okay, courage is what enables us to move on despite our fear. So meaning we can do things even when we are afraid. You can be feeling fear, but do not allow that fear to cripple you. So if it is in a relationship that is very toxic and very harsh, you have to master the courage one day to stand up and speak out, okay? And speak out as you try to define your boundaries, okay? And then the courage of loss of credibility. We need to have the courage to face our loss of credibility. The moment you mind so much about what people will say and how credible you are, you will not go far, because many people who are influential in their leadership in their lives have actually had to deal with the test of loss of credibility. The whole world should not be praising you and showering you with all, the praises. Sometimes you want everyone to praise us, but that can actually limit us. Sometimes you have to do things that are out of the box, that are, you flow against the tide, and people will not be happy with you at that moment. But if it is your passion driving you, then you know that is the courage that you need to push you to the other side. Because you see, if we move with a crowd, if we flow with, whatever everyone else is flowing with, then we may not do anything out of the ordinary. It is those who step out and do things out of the ordinary that actually end up influencing and moving the world. Yes, so when you're in a very fearful state, at that point you're facing the fear factor, whether it is a human being, whether it is a sickness, whatever it is, try to make sure you take deep breath. Take deep breath. That is very good for allowing more oxygen to reach the vital parts of your body. Make sure you have enough exercise. Exercise. When you're in a fearful situation, sometimes it helps to step out at that point and walk. Take a walk out and look at the world, in a different way. It's important to take plenty of water, of course, plenty of fluids. And let's practice confident speech when you're faced with an authoritative figure that is very intimidating. Try to practice the, confident speech and stick to your point. Stick to your values, stick to whatever you're pushing for, and manage your emotions at that point, because you don't want to bring out things in anger, but you want to bring it out in a calm way. So meaning you have to manage your fear as much as possible as you stick to your point. Okay. Yes, so those are some of the few ways we can use to confront fear. But let's remember that fear actually causes loss of destinies. It causes loss of purpose much more than failure does. And so we should confront the fear, and we should not live in a fearful situation, because there are chronic effects that may affect our lives and even cause premature death. Thank you so much for being part of Living a Full Life Forum. I kindly ask you to share. I know there are people out there who will benefit from some of these posts that we are putting out there. Please share, please do subscribe, and tell your friends to also subscribe. Thank you and have a blessed day.